Thanks guys for coming to the Critical Information Conference. My name is Eric Sutphin. I'm a second-year MFA student here at the Art Writing and Criticism program. This is Susan B. She'll be our faculty respondent for the panel. And I guess I wanted to just say off the bat really briefly that I realize that the topics that I'm covering in this particular panel seem sort of wildly divergent, but that I brought them together under the framework of areas of study that are in some way marginalized or on the periphery of conventional study. So, and I hope that by bringing them together, that each of the panelists will show a way in which these things can be discussed and talked about that furthers the discourse and broadens the perspective on these respective studies. And the first panelist is Ayanna Serenity Dozier, and she will be presenting first. And so I'll turn it over to Ayanna.
Just a quick explanation on the title. I do believe on the handout it says OBPI, the Pornokitsch aesthetic and visual arts. I'm working on this as my master's thesis, so as I continue to progress, it changes slightly. It's still essentially the same, but just a bit more focused. So, with that. This analysis will seek the ways in which contemporary performance artists are using posthuman identity as a vehicle to engage with transgressive representations of their sexuality. Artists such as Shuli Shung, Mariko Mori, Lynn Hirschman, Kumara Rosa, Maria Betty, and others are creating work that foregrounds the idea of a posthuman sexuality. This argument is a negotiation of two different theories, with posthuman identity on the one hand, and sexuality and sexual practice on the other. Within these performances, contemporary artists are showing how, through the posthuman identity, sexuality can be transformed into consumable activity that defies morality and heteronormative restrictions. They are attempting to redefine humanity through the posthuman, thus creating a world where the post-techno-human inhabitant can exist without archaic and at times misinformed classifications of race, gender, and sexuality. The posthuman body is a queered body. It is an abject body that transgresses the lines of real and artifice. This method of abjection is a departure from Donna Haraway's The Promise of Monsters, a regenerative politics for inappropriate others, where she argues for the acceptance of abjection on a social scale as a way to undo the invented traditional gender relations and constructions. While her original argument was in favor of the cyborg, her supposition could further be expanded and has to include the broader range of posthumanism. Through the process of biotechnical and biochemical alteration, the posthuman provides a portal for oppositional identity to engage with discourse that favors the invention of a new sexual relational exchange in society. So what is an example of the posthuman body? The posthuman body is a body that has been altered with the aid of mechanics and thus exists within a state of hybridity. A clear example of such alterations is a cyborg, a constructed being of flesh and machine to create an unnatural life force. There is potential within the cyborg for people to construct an identity with the use of prostheses that does not adhere to conventional gender normal identities, as outlined again by Haraway in Cyborg Manifesto, Science, Technology, and Socialist Feminism in the late 20th century. But that argument was nearly 30 years ago. An expansion is needed to understand what the posthuman identity entails in our contemporary society. Anne Bassanlo extends Haraway's manifesto to the construction of the cyborg gendered body and on the cutting edge and the technological production of the gendered body. Bassanlo asserts that cosmetic surgery is used as an apparatus to reinforce the presentation of the conventional gendered body. As stated here, quote, "Cosmetic surgeons use technology imagining devices to reconstruct the female body as a signifier of ideal feminine beauty. In this sense, surgical techniques literally enact the logic of an ascending line of beauty. Difference is made over into sameness. The technological gaze refashions a material body to reconstruct it in keeping with culturally determined ideals of feminine beauty." End quote. These cultural determined ideals of beauty are seen as a representation of conventional gender portrayals or gender normals. To describe such normative representations of gender, I will use the term cisgendered or cis as defined by Christian Schultz and Laurel Westbrook as those who believe their gendered identity is an extension of their biological sex. And while the bulk of Balsamo's argument is that technology only aids the production of cisgenders, she does note that the same production of gender can be subverted and exercised on a performative level through the embodiment of technology. This phenomenon is articulated as techno-phenomenology by Amelia Jones in Dispersed Subjects and the Demise of the Individual. This techno-phenomenology exists today, albeit not so rigid and/or as a hard machine example of surgery. Working through the sphere of the biopower, participants are softening their technobodies with the aid of hormones to create soft machines whose gender is explicitly linked with their own sexuality, in which this analysis will seek to further explore. A noticeable gap in the field of the posthumanities is the connection between this techno-gender identity and the techno-sexuality that the gender is explicitly linked to. The posthuman identity arrived at the end of the 19th century and multiplied in the 20th century with the invention and consumption of prostheses and biochemical modifications. Biochemical and biotechnical apparatuses such as vibrators, hormones, Viagra, and the pill are creating a generation that use a posthuman to alter their sexuality. Society's consumptions with these apparatuses is a key example of how identity is connected to sexuality, and that the use of biotechnical and biochemical modifications are altering conventional definitions of humanity. These modifications can be used as weapons to confront, challenge, and fuck with heteronormative structures and gender binaries. Therefore, through the process of embodying the posthuman, we are challenging the foundation by which our current environment exists in, inhabiting our world with monsters, as it were. A statement echoed by Beatrice Preciado and Testo Junkie, Sex, Drugs, Biopolitics, and the Pharmacopornographic Era, which this analysis owes a considerable debt to. Preciado's construction of what he terms as technosexuality is an extension of Foucault's intellection of the biopolitical body. The biopolitical body is a response to the politicizing of the body by the government. Foucault demonstrates this understanding through his writings on the creation of government institutions as modes of classifying and separating the body according to sex. Preciado asserts that the production of the body via biochemical apparatuses and prostheses has created a new techno-organic condition, or sort of soft machine. The soft machine cyborg is present within our current culture through the use of biochemical and physical apparatuses once again. Preciado argues for technosexualities as a prospect of a soft machine in order to create a blurring of sexual binaries and genders that lends itself to a new system of classification. And that system of classification is extended to the technosexuality in which I just described, but also a term that she describes as contrasexuality, in which I'm going to use synonymously as a form of a technological construction of gender and sexuality. The use of biochemical and physical apparatuses inspire the exploration of orifices outside of heteronormative sexual practices. Preciado argues for the use of the dildo as the origin of contrasexuality and the completion of all sexualities, as it precedes the penis. It is precisely this logic that I am extending this argument of posthuman sexuality to the physical apparatus of the vibrator. The use of the vibrator contains a more mechanical behavior to it than the dildo. It is a literal image of the metaphorical conjugal relationship that mankind has with technology, penetrating itself. Let me be clear, when I state performing posthuman sexuality, I'm discussing the performative act of sex, sexuality, desire of sex, and sexual practice through the posthuman identity. As such, these performances are transformative as they performing a sexuality that doesn't exist within society's classifications or binaries. These contemporary performance artists, as listed earlier, are aware of this and are using this to broadcast these transgressive acts explicitly and publicly. While the explicitity varies from artist to artist, the implications are clear. They illustrate how autonomy can be achieved for all through the posthuman identity. As stated earlier, the posthuman is a hybrid that can encompass a variation of identities, and thus has an appeal to people who have been marginalized by these classifications. To further solidify this argument, I will go in depth, or at least a brief analysis into a singular piece by Xu Li Sheng. It is a science fiction pornographic film that she made in 2000 titled A Coup. The artist Shu Li Sheng considers herself a digital nomad. Working with the internet and computer and technology, she has helped pioneer a post-internet aesthetic. One of her early pieces was an interactive website dedicated to Brandon, the transgendered man who was brutally raped and murdered, as further explored in Kimberly Pierce's film Boys Don't Cry. By using the internet in the age of dial-up in the AOL Messenger, Sheng was proposing a new method of connecting with one another, long before Web 2.0 imploded over the digital sphere. Her subsequent film, IQ, This Is Not Love, This Is Sex, uses graphics found over the internet looped on screen over the pornographic images. Sheng is clearly playing with the medium as porn, at the time, was only beginning to find its home on the web. Thus, this digital film is replicating the art and aesthetics found on the web and marrying the relationship the viewer experiences while watching porn on the internet. Sheng's involvement with the concept of post-internet is instrumental because it shows a fascination with the post-idiom. Her work and the work of other artists listed are interested in life after technology, life after death, life after the internet. How machine and mankind can interact with one another, and how we may use the opportunity to further progress ourselves. The post is not about humanity, but rather about the improvement of humanity. How can we forego heteronormative culture and embrace the unnatural? And most importantly, how can we use the totality of sexuality to our own benefit without the threat of moral decay? This post stage is the answer to those questions, and the artists who continue to engage in the discussion by performing post-human sexuality now. This is not love, this is sex, and this is about the journey to becoming fully autonomous with ourselves. Sex then becomes a freely exchanged commodity that is fully and regularly consumed, as noted by Claudia Springer. Quote, "These contemporary texts represent a future where human bodies are on the verge of becoming obsolete, but sexuality nevertheless prevails," end quote. What is interesting to note is that the prospect of sex doesn't exist with a partner, but rather can also be explored through the individual, a practice that is explicitly exercised by Beatrice Preciado in the opening pages of Testo Junkie. Shu Li Sheng's IQ is in many ways a homage to the cyberpunk film Blade Runner, and actually picks up where Blade Runner left off in an elevator. In Sheng's film, though, we first encounter a transgendered lesbian while she conjugates her relationship with a replicant model.
All right, so when I began studying this topic, I was really surprised by the amount of negative reactions I received. People questioning why I would be interested in Haiti as a subject of investigation. I've traveled extensively around the world, including to developing countries, and yet more than any other place I've traveled to, people cited danger of crime and of rape and of general lawlessness as reasons I shouldn't go or pursue this topic. Others didn't understand why I would travel to Haiti if I wasn't going to do volunteer work, as though the only purpose of a foreign visitor is to offer aid to the people there. And the reason for this is that Haiti is portrayed to Western audiences through the singular lens of victimhood and degradation. It is a country spoken about in superlatives, as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. In addition, Western media outlets tend to focus on negative images of the country, such as political instability, mass poverty, disease, and human suffering. This tendency was only exacerbated by the catastrophic earthquake of January 10, 2010, as media capitalized on images of disrepair, death, destruction, etc. Yet such a reductive viewpoint does not take into account any of Haiti's rich cultural history. They have an extremely strong artistic culture, and through their art they transmit concepts of historical, cultural, spiritual, and political significance. Haitian art is particularly influenced by the Afro-Caribbean spiritual practice of voodoo, which is practiced by the majority of the country in some capacity. Initially, many of the objects that I'm going to show were crafted for use in voodoo ceremonies, and they were not considered for their aesthetic appeal as an art object. However, as Haitian voodoo art began to receive international demand as a consumer item, artists modified their creative practices and they made them further from the traditional voodoo vernacular in order to accommodate and appeal to the global market. So voodoo religion is really important for understanding Haiti's cultural and historical identity. And it really is key to understanding how Haitian history is viewed by Haiti's poor majority. It's a combination of West and Central African religions, and it became the commonality through which disparate slave groups found solidarity. It's also an allegory for Haiti's fight against slavery and colonization, and it aided in the successful slave revolution which led to the establishment of the world's first Black republic. During periods in history, the religion has been subject to persecution and repression, and in order to ensure its survival, adherents have incorporated other iconography into the religion. So for instance, they reshaped traditional Catholic icons and incorporated them into the symbolic range of voodoo imagery, and this has ensured the religion's survival. Even today, voodoo continues to reshape itself, absorbing new beliefs and penetrating into daily life. So the earliest form of voodoo art to gain recognition in the international market are ceremonial flags, known as drapeau voodoo. These flags are among the most sacred objects in the voodoo temple, and their presence is essential in most voodoo rites. The ritualistic use of these flags represents the power and strength of deities, which are known as lois. Until the mid-20th century, drapeau was crafted purely for ceremonial use. However, voodoo priests began to realize the aesthetic appeal of drapeau, and so they began crafting flags to be sold, and these helped support their voodoo societies. So the image you see here is by Sylva Joseph, who is an active voodoo priest and part of the Bel Air School of Flag Making. And these flags are crafted in a more traditional style. So you can see there's the fringe and there's the sleeve on the left, which is to attach to a stave. And the central motif is based off a Catholic chromolithograph. Ogou is the paramount masculine spirit in the Loa pantheon. However, he is frequently associated with St. James Major. By contrast, this is a contemporary voodoo flag, and it demonstrates how the newer generation of artists have evolved the art form. So part of the newer generation includes Merlin Constant, whose work is pictured here, and she's one of the forefront female drapeau artists. And these newer generations can include non-voodoo leaders, and they're decentralized from the Bel Air district, which is where most of the drapeau flags were initially crafted. So this piece has a more decorative purpose. It's not religious or ceremonial. Since art dealers and tourists are interested in the aesthetic function of the drapeau, these pieces are conceptualized more as paintings to hang flat on a wall. So you can see that they lack the fringe and the sleeve that was found in the previous image because they're not going to hang on a stave. They're going to hang flat on a wall. Constant also revolutionized the genre by incorporating round and cylindrical beads. And she also created more three-dimensional perspective in her imagery, giving it a more painterly quality. Newer drapeau artists also have more complex, detailed, and extravagant imagery. Present-day flag makers will also move beyond traditional voodoo subject matter and create new subject matter, in part because they need to individuate themselves in an increasingly competitive market. So I'm going to show you a detail from the previous piece. It's actually a 7-foot tableau, and the piece is bearing witness to the aftermath of the 2010 earthquake. So Constant is depicting the Gen family, which is the Loa of death, and they're struggling to handle the enormity of their duties in the post-earthquake Haiti. So Constant is still working with voodoo themes, but she's relating them to contemporary issues in Haitian society.
Social scientists have offered many reasons why porn is an important area of study. It's not only an enormous economic force, but it's been a driving force behind the technological development and deployment of almost every type of media. It makes us reflect on questions of power and tolerance. It can facilitate a deeper understanding of human sexuality. And it's been argued that porn can provide us with a map of our culture's borders. As Laura Kipnis argues, because pornography exists at the edge of a culture's decorum, carefully tracing that edge can reveal a detailed blueprint of our culture's anxieties, investments, and contradictions. I approach porn from a feminist cultural studies perspective, meaning that I'm interested in pornography as a cultural phenomenon. Specifically, I'm interested in how the changes brought about by porn's growth online affect not only our culture, but our experiences and perceptions of sexuality. And I'm interested in how the generations that grow up and come of age in this era are affected by the abundance of online pornography and the mainstreaming of commercial sex. I argue that with pornography's growth online in the last 2 decades, and with the advent of new media technologies such as broadband, e-commerce, and webcams, pornography has fundamentally changed. So I'm going to begin by discussing the different ways that the genre has changed with its evolution online, and then go on to discuss what this means for those of us studying it. The internet brought pornography further into the privacy of the home and made it exponentially more accessible. And this led to a dramatic increase in the number of porn consumers because it's simply far more available. With this expansion in consumer base, there was a virtual explosion of porn online. And this boom enabled porn producers to diversify their products and to target specialist tastes and niche markets that would be impossible to sustain offline. These days, virtually any fantasy or scenario that you can dream up can be found online. That being said, the majority of mainstream pornography is heteronormative. It depicts fairly homogeneous, repetitive forms of sex and sexual representation, and it contains highly normative scripts of gender and sexuality. In other words, mainstream porn, for the most part, depicts the same kinds of bodies performing the same kinds of acts in the same kinds of scenarios over and over and over. And if you're looking for free porn, that's predominantly what you're going to find. But while these representations are the most common, the easiest to access, and the ones that are seeping into mainstream culture, they're just one of the many types of pornographies available online. And in fact, sex on the internet actually displays a diversity never before seen in the pornography industry. The sheer amount of material available online and the constant drive among porn producers to diversify and push boundaries has actually made room for more diverse representations. And in many ways, online porn has fragmented into a number of subgenres. And so mainstream heteroporn is at one end of what's actually a whole spectrum of possibilities. And at the other end of that spectrum, we find porn that's transgressive, subversive, and constantly challenging the mainstream. So the clearest example of this is queer porn, a subcategory of porn that works to subvert and destabilize the gender binary and to challenge sexual power dynamics. And it achieves this through the portrayal of what have been called insubordinate, disobedient, and unruly bodies, performing acts that subvert and invert normative roles and power dynamics. So where homogeneous, heteronormative porn presents rigid and formulaic representations of gender and sexuality performed by a very limited range of bodies, queer porn draws on a diverse range of bodies, gender identities, sexual performances, and scenarios, and provides endless combinations of each. And though still by no means a mainstream form of representation, queer porn as a genre has undergone massive growth online, and it's just one example of how the content of online porn is diverse and continues to offer new possibilities. Beyond changes in content and consumer base, we're also seeing major changes in the ways people are consuming porn. Media technologies are now undeniably part of the fabric of ordinary life. And it's now argued that the consumption of pornography is increasingly becoming part of everyday online multitasking, as users move between socializing, buying commodities, searching for information, chatting, peeping, cruising, masturbating, and maintaining friendships. The relationship between sex and technology is an old and established one. Technology has always been adapted for sexual purposes, and sex often drives technological development. It's now widely acknowledged that sex has shaped the internet as it currently exists. And consumer demand for pornography has been the driving force behind the development of technologies such as servers, streaming software, chat forums, and e-commerce payment systems. And this technology continues to develop. And because of this relationship, the very nature of online pornography continues to evolve and change at a rapid pace. The changes we're seeing in the consumption of online porn are linked to broader changes in the way people use the internet to create, consume, and share information. We're now in an era of online communication that many are calling Web 2.0. This is a more participatory generation of media making that's characterized by sharing, collaboration, and user-generated content. 2.0 websites offer a communal and interactive context for sharing and consuming media. So the perfect example of this is Wikipedia, an online encyclopedia made up of unlocked, editable content, so that entries are not only user-generated, but in a constant state of revision. As you read, you can edit, add, and erase content. And this blurs the line between knowledge production and knowledge consumption. And what we're finding is that changes in the way porn is being accessed, shared, and consumed are keeping pace with these broader changes in web use, ushering in a new era of online porn that some are calling Porn 2.0. Porn 2.0 refers to the multiple new ways to consume and interact with pornography. In addition to being able to produce your own amateur porn to post on user-generated YouTube-style sites, porn consumers can now post comments on videos they've watched. They can compile interactive lists of their favorite videos on each site, join website forums, watch live webcams while chatting, post response videos, or even share their own webcam footage. And the porn consumer now actively organizes and controls their pornography. And these changes are blurring the boundaries between producer, performer, distributor, and consumer. And they're also threatening the porn industry's previously indestructible business model. Amateur porn has become a huge part of the material being accessed online, and it's virtually impossible for porn producers to match the volume of product coming out of user-generated sites. Further complicating things is the rise in porn aggregators. These are websites such as Pornhub.com that compile and organize porn from numerous online sources, masking the original source and making a huge database of material available free of charge. And if you then factor in the many ways in which online porn can be ripped, downloaded, torrented, shared, you can see how the amount and availability of free porn continues to grow exponentially. Who knows what these changes will mean or where they'll lead us? But what's clear is that pornography is now a fluid genre and one that's in a constant state of change. And unfortunately, the majority of work being done in contemporary porn studies has failed to evolve with these changes in the genre itself. What I'm finding is that research and theorizing tends to cling to outdated definitions and conceptual frameworks that severely limit the scope of work being done. And in addition, the majority of work in this field remains split across a pro-porn, anti-porn divide, with theorists either defending pornography as a site of sexual liberation, freedom, and possibilities, or condemning it as a site of abuse, contempt, and moral decline. And we seem to have lost the middle ground, where pornography can be many of these things, or different shades of each. Oh. Yes, that's right. As we've seen between the exponential growth in consumer base and volume of product, and the constant push for diversification of product, and then the changes in the way porn is being consumed, pornography is no longer a singular phenomenon. It is not one thing. It is instead a genre of consumption with many branches. It's a set of cultural practices that is in a constant state of change. In other words, porn is a single term that refers to a large and heterogeneous body of material that's created and consumed in a variety of ways. And just as there's no longer a single discernible pornography, there's also no single attitude towards it, reaction to it, or relationship with it. If we hope to uncover how porn is used, understood, and experienced in our culture, we need a set of tools that are as fluid and adaptive as porn itself. To this end, I've developed a framework for studying porn that conceptualizes it as a constellation of possibilities, rather than one specific thing. And this allows for an understanding of pornographies that not only acknowledges its history and makes room for future incarnations, but allows for different forms of porn and the various effects of each to coexist. This approach makes room for the gray areas and acknowledges that there's a fluid spectrum of possibilities and intersections that falls between the poles of liberation and oppression. This means that my analysis can at once recognize and honor the liberatory and transgressive potential of certain types of porn while still allowing for the evaluation of porn's dangers and negative effects. And by conducting research within this kind of framework, we can single out problem areas and condemn specific practices while recognizing that these aren't necessarily characteristic of pornography in its entirety. So what I'm hoping is that this kind of research will allow for more nuanced research. This kind of approach will allow for more nuanced research into how different types of porn are created, consumed, thought about, interpreted, embraced, and resisted, and into how its uses change across time and context. And it's only with this type of analysis that we'll begin to develop an understanding of what porn truly means in this historical moment.
Thank you. I just have a couple of closing remarks. So there are a few things that came to mind when I was listening to you, which is the problem of commodification and reification emerges in a number of areas throughout these papers, in relation also to Haiti and those practitioners. And then the body in the posthuman avatar is brought into the realm of utility. And Jessica, you talk about the occlusions and the kind of empty spaces in the study of pornography. So kind of loosely thinking about sort of sites that are, in a way, there's either not an adequate kind of study on these particular topics, or there are spaces within the studies that aren't accounting for something. So I think with that in mind, I'd like to open it up to questions and a discussion.
Do the panelists have any questions for each other or issues that you'd like to address before we go to the floor, so to speak?
Yeah, I was actually interested in Samantha. Fine, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Your topic on Haiti and Haitian practices of using video almost as like a counter aesthetic. I was just wondering, aside from the contemporary, which we're kind of focusing on, I know there's almost like a historical lineage there, or at least in certain territories in the Caribbean, of using like the Bacu figurines, or kind of using discarded materials to create new material or repurpose it. I just was wondering, has your research led you to kind of do a historical analysis to kind of link the past to the present, or no?
Most of the stuff historically rooted in Haiti is dealing with more bucolic landscapes and sort of this idolized image of the peasant farmer, and that for a long time was the dominant framework that art historians used to talk about Haiti, and it was also viewed as naive peasant art, and that that's sort of become an outdated framework and has fallen out of favor. But the discarded materials in this sense in these sculptures have not been seen before. There's been, for instance, in Jacmel, which is further south of Port-au-Prince, there's been a long tradition of crafting masks that are used in carnival celebrations, and things can be repurposed and included, but not to the sense where the entire piece is a refabrication. And in this instance, in the more contemporary instance, a lot of it is done very intentionally, as opposed to just necessity. A lot of it is done to kind of pun the world market. For instance, the resistance artists did a piece where they made a sculpture out of boots. And a huge issue in Haiti is that because they received so much foreign clothes and whatever that are given, that it's decimated the garment making industry. And so part of the donated items they receive are boots. And Haiti is an incredibly tropical, very warm climate. So nobody really had any use for these boots. They're not practical for the region. So the artist made a piece out of that, kind of highlighting the impractical nature of it. And so then the discarded items themselves really became part of the content of the piece, as opposed to just needing something to fill a space, and it was there.
Any other questions for each other?
I was actually wondering a little bit about, you mentioned that the next big event is lens free. And I was wondering what the impact of that is and what the meaning of that a little bit.
Well, the impact I'll find out when I go down there, because it's going on right now. So, like I said, it's a 1 to 3 week period where the artists, the Western artists will come in and create their work. I'm going for the tail end, which will have there's a conference at the end that kind of wraps it up, and I'll see the pieces more towards their completion. So the second Biennale happened pretty shortly after the earthquake, and the co-creator and curator, she's based out of the UK, her name's Leah Gordon. She really was very critical of a lot of things that erupted during the second Biennale, because it became very performative in terms of, so in Haiti there's a huge NGO culture, and that really has changed the social fabric, and people were acting out this sort of victim donor mentality, and there were like Haitian people that were coming in and just saying things like, why don't you have t-shirts? Like, why don't you have handouts? Like, because there was this expectation that the Westerners come in and they give something, and then the Haitians are the passive victim recipients. And I think that part of what, so she's trying to disrupt that. And then on top of that, I think with the lens, it creates sort of an otherness and an exotification. And so she really wanted to make it lens-free as an experiment to try and disrupt that notion and really get people engaging in a more face-to-face manner. In terms of, I don't know how successful it is, because I haven't been down yet, but I do know I got an email from her today reiterating it's lens-free. So I don't know if people haven't been respecting that, or that could be a problem.
Does that also have to do with the commercialization of the artwork? In other words, one of the ways that, like the Miami Basel Fair, they constantly putting up images for sale and giving you a sense of how much things cost, I would think that would be an issue in this also.
Yeah, well, a lot of the things there are not even saleable goods, because some of them are site-specific or performative and can't really be placed on a market in that sense.
Uh-huh.
But I do think what's interesting is that when I've spoken to her, a lot of the Western artists who come in are really creating work that's kind of critical of the Biennale system, critical of the art market, and really kind of trying to distance themselves from it. And by contrast, the Haitian artists who are incorporated in the Biennale really want access to that market. They can't even be critical of it because they haven't had the privilege of choosing to be critical of it. They want to be in it. And so that's another point of kind of contention and disruption that I'm interested in looking at when I go down there.
Do you have a sense of how because you talked about, I think in your paper that I read, there were a number of commercial galleries or small commercial galleries in Haiti. So I was wondering if you have a sense of how Haiti's inclusion in the Biennale in 2011 might have affected the local art scene or the local art market in Port-au-Prince maybe, or among these collectives?
Well, most of the galleries are located in this area called Pétionville, which is a little bit outside Port-au-Prince proper. It's up on the hill, and it's a wealthier district. It's where Haiti's elite live generally, and obviously where a lot of foreign aid workers live. And the galleries there tend to focus more. I mean, there's a range. Some will show Drapo, some will show a lot of the traditional bucolic landscapes, but they're not interested in as much in avant-garde art and cutting. And another interesting thing is that a lot of those gallerists are actually very critical of the Ghetto Biennale. They don't think that it should be held. I mean, it's held literally in the Grenry district, which is a poor area in downtown Port-au-Prince. So there have been gallerists that have come down there and been offended because they don't want foreigners coming in and seeing this as a representation of Haiti. They don't want them to see the poverty or the waste or the refuse. They want them to come to the white walled galleries up on the hill that's more distance from that. So there's again like another disjoint in terms of the intentions of that group, of the traditional gallery group, versus what's going on the ground with the Grenry area.
Does anybody, any questions? Yes.
I actually had a question for you about your research and how the extreme access and availability may be leading to a sense of almost familiarity with porn on the internet, how that has like infiltrated the art market and the use of more pornographic imagery in certain art projects. Is that also going to factor into your research?
Yes. I mean, we'll see where my research goes. For now, what I'm envisioning is just starting with a series of focus groups, talking about the meaning of pornography in our lives. But because going into researching my project, I'm coming up against the fact that research is so limited right now, I really did have to stop and find a new approach. So I can only imagine what I'm going to find when I start investigating. I'm sure that will be a part of it. It's absolutely what's happening. It's infiltrating all aspects of our lives. But I'll see. I'll see with my dissertation work.
Yes. Oh, wait.
Have you, so these are all really good examples of how basic, well, this context, these are all sort of philosophical institutions, gender, sex, race, and sort of mass media issues that are now being expanded because of consumer market growth. And so we're all sort of discussing the transmutation of expected definitions or defined values. And so these are all really cool examples. And what I'd ask specifically for you is, wouldn't you see it as sort of postmodern effect in sort of online porno? I have a friend, granted, this is not my person. So I feel as though we've now entered these sort of real world road rules MTV reality porn, where in essence now we're utilizing the sort of female role, the blonde, the brunette, and we're putting them in more public domains, more likely happenings that we would all experience. One being, making out in the club or, down the alley, meeting a stranger, simulating real events, but now approaching that in sort of a very interesting way. And I think that's something intriguing to point out as far as the sort of boundary of what we define as.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
Yeah, and there's this interesting thing happening where I think the amateur is more a representation of real life, but then the big porn companies are trying to imitate
Of
amateur,
course.
and so it's
You see
constantly
well-produced, simulated,
yeah.
grimy things. And can I make voodoo art too?
Yeah.
That was my question.
Oh, that
can
was
I
your
make voodoo
question.
art? Is it socially acceptable if I were to undertake, the process of making voodoo art, or would it be art in general?
Well, I think you could make artworks that imitate artworks that are voodoo inspired, but I think to make a traditional voodoo piece, one has to be initiated and into the priesthood, and there's certain ceremonial aspects that a lay person wouldn't do, because literally to the voodoo priest, these are objects that have either protective powers or, depending on which law that they're representing, like they literally consider them magical items.
And is there a school of any sort? I'm being like, is there an art school? Is there a voodoo initiation interest in order to then sort of make these objects amongst the youth?
You mean, is there an art school that specifically focuses on voodoo-based art?
is there a club or group or faction that is now teaching younger individuals how to make?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely.
That,
It's not just one. I mean, there's a variety. The resistance artists actually have a new faction that's called the little. No, that's literally what it's called, and they'll start training kids as young as about 8 or 9, and doing the same types of procedures that they're doing.
and yeah, no, that was my question. I just find that intriguing.
And is it girls and boys who do this kind of work?
For the most part, it's been predominantly male.
Mm-hmm. But Constant is such an important force, right?
She is, and she's not the only. So with the resistance artists, that's been predominantly male. With the Draco artists, the newer Constant, and there's another female artist who's starting to break onto the scene.
Mm-hmm.
But they've been, prior to that, it was all traditionally male.
Even though it involves sewing?
Yeah.
Okay, so the men sew the flags?
Once some of the Draco artists, once they gain a certain level of popularity, they'll have other people that will hand sew it for them, and they'll just do the design and the template.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of them will learn they'll begin by hand sewing it all themselves.
Yeah.
This one's for Jessica. Like, I don't know a better terminology. I guess porn 1.0 and porn 2.0, but being like this sort of shift in the emergence of porn 2.0, have you looked at like the sort of labor statistics, the concept of a porn star, and what does the 2.0 do to the traditional model of the 1.0 industry? As I'm guessing that they're trying to create strategies to sort of either like mimic in higher quality or separate themselves from 2.0. But I'm kind of wondering, what does that do to like the ability for, like, I guess the performers to create income out of this and sort of in a way democratize sexuality and sort of, I don't know, dumbs down or muddles the concept of the porn star.
It definitely muddles it, and it really complicates the industry. I think the traditional big porn companies are kind of scrambling and trying to figure out what this means, that there's still a huge amount of porn being produced, and so there is still an economy there, but it's actually also opening up fringe economies where people can effectively become a porn producer in their own bedroom and start making money on their own and be producer, performer, distributor, and so it creates new bubble economies on the margins, which is actually really interesting.
It's also fascinating that we're all photographers, we're all writers, and we can all have these facilities now because of technology.
Yeah.
So it's only natural that all of these definitions do extend,
Absolutely.
morally and ethically, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to ask you about, actually I'm glad the technology gives us a chance to create new forms of sexuality, but it also comes with a new kind of sexual crimes, because it also starts appearing as well. So I would like to know about your point, the points of view of each of you about what are the roles about artists and producers and us as viewers about these new kinds of sexual crimes. For example, I remember that there was a moment during the game Second Life that a hacker was able to start raping some other avatars, in the game. Other moments, for example, robots, the use of robots. That now we have ERA. I don't know if you, it's a new sexual toy that you can use that remotely, so you can control that. So the person in one side of the world can control the movements of the other one. In case of a hacker changing that, you also change the possibility of a sex crime. So how do you think this should be worked on? I don't know.
And maybe you could answer first. Since you talked.
Yeah. I think when it comes to issues like that, especially with rape and or in the ways by which pleasure can be subverted and not in a good way and or dominated by this kind of by society, namely by males. No offense to those in the audience. And I kind of go back to how I ended my argument with the extent that in order for this kind of, male to female domination, male to female penetration, and or the ways by which, females and or women are abused, I guess, and answering your question, you kind of have to queer the culture. Because this kind of ideology and this kind of persistence for envisioning new modes of sexuality does not exist within a queer culture. Or that might be a blanket statement, but it's the extent of queering the traditional to invent the new. Because traditional, more or less, is a myth that we kind of participate in without questioning it. And I think it's under that myth and under that regulation by which, instances of rape can occur. So I think in a queer culture, rape wouldn't happen. So.
And I think these kinds of abuses that take place the fact that they're happening within the technology within these is more a reflection of our culture itself. And like going back to that Laura Kipnis quote, you can trace the boundaries of our culture by looking at what exists in pornography. So I think looking specifically at rape, instead of condemning pornography, instead of condemning the technology, you have to look at why it's happening in the first place and what that means about our society more broadly.
Yeah, you in the back there.
This is for Ayanna and also Jessica. I was thinking about the intersection between technology and sexuality and our increasing ability to modify our bodies, with like either partial, like with part machines or appendages or whatever.
Because we can't. It's really hard to see you. Oh, but there you are.
And I was wondering what your thoughts were on, even as they're increasingly sort of accessible venues to see a wider variety of types of porn, how technology can affect the physical bodies that you do see. For example, I was thinking, I know HD TV has had a big impact on the porn industry because you can see every single pore in like a person's like face and body, and these bodies that we expect to be perfect now, sort of many people are having more surgeries or more intensive makeup regimens. But I was sort of wondering about the manipulation of the bodies based on the technological distribution.
I think, let me just see what, try to answer your question. You're stating more or less that with technology, there's either more of a production of a particular idealized body,
but are they more creative, like body modifications or something that technology has enabled or sort of sparked, I don't know.
Yeah, I think I quoted Anne Samo in her article on the cutting edge. She kind of goes really in depth about how we see technology as kind of like this reification of gender representation and or the cisgendered body, but you can subvert that, and that extension is also linked to those who had a picture of Orlan, you know, the performance artist who has had multiple surgeries just to kind of enhance and kind of progress herself to some kind of other. And I think in terms of the latter portion of your question, we were talking about like the introduction of like HD TV and newer speeds. I think more or less that kind of only destabilizes the like the myth of the idealized body, because then you do see everything and you do kind of you're able to really take in how the technolized gendered body is a body of artifice, and kind of like view and then just kind of see like in the ways by which it's unnatural, and I guess by viewing that as unnatural, it's easier to accept those who use technology to subvert their bodies.
You also mentioned Stellark, right, in your original paper, and his suspensions of the body and sort of like rendering it machinal versus maybe like bringing it into the realm of utility, pure utility versus something that's like thinking or acting. So I think that he kind of represents, or his work is work that's like dealing with this like push of the body into a prosthesis,
right,
versus something that we know
is more mechanical, so to speak. Yeah.
Can I ask one more question?
Wait 1 second.
Oh,
Did you
were going to
want to
respond.
say respond?
I mean, I could, but I think you did a really good job.
Well, before you ask one more question, let me just take this person here. Yeah.
Jessica, I was curious about how with the social media porn, if you looked at the comment fields or other kinds of ways that that social media helps people to reinscribe those norms onto porn, or if there is like a spectrum, say, of normative and non-normative, I wonder how it shows up in user interactions, certain ways of kind of policing norms online.
Well, I mean, the big problem is that there's so much happening that research is having a really hard time keeping up. So there is work being done looking at the forums themselves, and looking at the forums in different places, but they don't talk to each other. So there's research looking at mainstream hetero forums and how increasingly there's this shift in the porn consumer from being constructed as solitary, seedy in the shadows, to this like kind of community and camaraderie of this brotherhood of we're all watching this together and talking about it. But there isn't any work right now connecting those forums to the forums on more to queer forums and to queer sites, to the things that are happening on the margin and the periphery, and unfortunately, because research is having such a hard time keeping up with the rate at which things are changing, like research done 5 years ago is out of date and is kind of meaningless now. So it's a problem we've never really encountered before with this kind of research. Because of that, the things on the margins are falling off the radar. So there's very little work on what's happening on the periphery, except that the people doing this kind of forward-thinking work are looking more and more at the margins. So I don't know if that answers your question, kind of.
Were you saying that there's a comment field in these? I mean, are there comments that?
Yeah.
And so you would have to read through those.
There's like the videos themselves will have a feed of comments below it, but then there's also interactive forums on the sites themselves.
So that would be something else you could research.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So your field is expanding.
All the time. Yeah, today it expanded, I think.
Okay, you had a question.
Oh, it's quick. Vintage voodoo, is it more sought after? Are the flags with the staff apparatus more expensive market-wise than more?
No, I think that a lot of, I mean, if it's a really well-known art, the example that I showed is a well-known flag maker, but generally most Western consumers don't even make the distinction. To them, they're really just looking for what has the most aesthetic appeal, and the newer generation flags have been crafted a lot to appeal to Western consumers. They're used they're more ornate, they use sequins, they have the round and cylindrical beading, and generally those are the ones that consumers gravitate towards.
And usually Western consumers then go back into the vintage realm then to sort of enhance market values. And so I just ask, and I wonder.
Yeah, I don't think most consumers now even make the distinction.
Okay.
Yes.
I was just thinking about the human skulls being used. And does that raise issues, the art market, customs, crossing borders, is, artwork using body parts? Is that, it seems to me it could be another problem area that needs to be investigated.
Yeah. As far as I know, I haven't heard anything about it, but that definitely could be an issue. And I mean, maybe part of it is just that they don't even declare it. I know that there have been issues with, particularly post-earthquake, trying to get works out, and there just wasn't an infrastructure in place to even ensure that they were properly shipped. So transportation has been a huge issue.
Any other questions from some other people that haven't asked questions?
I have a quick question actually for Jessica. I was really struck, I'm an art historian and I'm coming at this from the perspective, I think my question will illustrate that, but I was really struck not only by your argument, but also your decision not to use images in your presentation, and I'm sure obviously a very conscious decision with this. There's an interesting tension between this over familiarity that we all have with pornographic images at this point and then your decision not to use them. And I'm just wondering, I'm guessing you have to proceed from, I don't know, make a decision over, if you don't use those images, you just assume your audience will know what you're talking about, and we all probably do, or use them and risk sort of losing the focus of your audience because they are, titillating images. And I know in some presentations, even of people who are sort of denigrating porn for various reasons, there's almost a sort of reveling in the revulsion that occurs.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you can speak to that.
I've kind of made a very conscious decision from the start that I'm not investigating the images.
Yeah.
I'm investigating the culture that surrounds them.
Is that because they're problematic or just because you're...
No, because they're changing so quick, kind of, and because there is this huge variety. To pick one would be making a choice that's my choice, and that's not, I don't think it's about my perception of the images or the ones that I choose to view myself. It's about the broader culture surrounding them. And I think, and going through this PowerPoint yesterday, I already had to take something out that I don't think applies anymore. Like it literally is changing so fast that I would have to be constantly searching for images, and that's not what my work's about. I'm not doing textual analysis in my work. I'm talking about what this culture means and how it's changing and why, and yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay.
When you're doing your work, are you also looking for some sort of ethical framework? Or I know you use the word framework, and I was wondering what kind of framework you're actually proposing.
Well, I'm going to go in and do qualitative research, interviews, focus groups, speaking with people. But I think before I do that, I have to lay out the concepts that I'm relying on. And the conceptual framework is a way of saying these are the conceptualizations that frame the way I'm interpreting the issues, the way I'm phrasing the issues, the way I understand the terms I'm using. And I think it's being reflexive about my own research practice, so that from the start, I'm not claiming to be unbiased. I'm not claiming to not have a view or perspective, but if I lay out at the beginning how it is I'm conceptualizing these ideas, then it's literally a frame through which you can analyze what I'm doing. And so it's about being more transparent, I think, in my process.
So at the beginning of your research, you're going to create some kind of...
I won't physically build a frame, but that's what you're asking. But so this was a piece of my master's thesis, which will be the conceptual chapter within my dissertation.
Yeah.
So I'm building upon these ideas, building upon this work to then go and investigate what these cultures are and what's actually happening. So this was a process of finding a new way to study pornography that isn't so limiting, that isn't going to go out of date in 5 years.
Any other questions from the floor?
All right. I think with that we can close, and I'd like to thank you guys so much.